This is Debt Free in 30, where every week we talk to industry experts about debt, money, and personal finance. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
Today on Debt Free in 30, we're going to talk about the big picture when it comes to debt. My guest has lots of practical advice on how we as individuals can deal with debt, but he also has some great insights into how the economy as a whole is impacted by debt. In the second half of the interview, we explore the root causes of debt and discuss income inequality and how the tax system helps the rich get richer. So we cover a lot of ground on today's show. My guest is David Bond, and I asked him to start us off by giving me a brief introduction to his career.
I got a PhD in economics from Yale University and taught at various Canadian universities. I then was a senior civil servant running first the census and then the Department of Intellectual Property in the old Ministry of Consumer and Corporate Affairs. That was the patent, the trademark, the industrial design office, and then eventually I took over both the corporate side, including bankruptcy. And then I left that and became the chief economist for HSBC Bank in Canada and retired back in 1998 and have been living here in Kelowna for over the last 14 years.
I believe Mr. Bond is only the second PhD I've had as a guest on the show, and I wanted to have him on because he's got insights as an academic, a civil servant, and from working in industry, which is a very broad range of expertise. Statistics Canada recently reported that the ratio of household debt to disposable income is 167.8%. That's almost 170%. So my first question to Mr. Bond was, what exactly does that mean?
That means that we have debt per household that is more than it's 170% of the income you have after you've paid your taxes. That's mainly income tax and property taxes here in a particular city.
And this is pretty much the highest level we've ever had.
The highest level we've ever had.
When you look at it historically. So I'm looking at it going, okay, that sounds like a really big number, but when you look at the economy, everything seems to be good. I mean, unemployment is low, interest rates are low, the real estate market in most parts of the country is fairly strong. I guess we could argue about Vancouver perhaps, but is it really a problem that debt levels are that high?
Well, I mean, you can assume that the current situation is going to continue forever, but if you assume that, then you also assume that you'll live to be 255 or something. The basic point is that we live in an economy that has cycles. And the concern with debt of 170% of your disposable income is that if the economy goes into the tank, you may lose your job. And then how are you going to pay your debts? And if you can't pay your debts, what happens to the stability of the people who lent you the money? They themselves suffer a loss. And if their losses are too great, they may go bankrupt. So the concern is, let's make sure that you have enough capacity that in a relatively modest downturn, you'll still be able to service your debt.
So you raise a couple of points there. Let's talk about the equation first, household debt to household income. We talked about the debt side of it. What's happening on the income side of it? Because I would assume that if my debt is going up but my income's going up faster, I really don't have to worry. Is that what's happening?
Well, no. Your debt's going faster than your income, and that's the real concern.
And that's what could then start the whole chain reaction that you just described. Consumers get into trouble and then the banks get into trouble.
Yeah, that's partly it. But the other thing, of course, is that if your income stops going, period, and your debt continues to grow, you're in a hole and you're digging more. The first thing you should learn is when you're in a hole, stop digging.
So it looks like the economy's in good shape now. You can tell me whether that's actually true or not, but what could happen to get us into trouble, and what are the kind of shocks that you could see happening?
Well, I think the economy's got some soft spots. Certainly the energy sector is soft right now. Even though the price of oil has bounded back up to 50, I think it's going to stay below 50 for most of this year and next year. And that means a substantial reduction in our earnings. But let's suppose that, for example, the United States goes into a recession. That's our biggest export market, and that would have an adverse impact upon the economy of Canada. The second thing is the softwood lumber dispute is about to start up again, and that could have a significant impact, particularly in both east of the Maritimes and Quebec and here in BC. What else could happen? You could have a major meltdown in Europe, which could set off a global recession in one way or another. Or China could really have a major fault, and that could have another impact that would be adverse to Canada. We're an open economy. We're a small economy in the world, and as a consequence, events outside of Canada can have a significant impact on Canada.
So do you worry about interest rates going up?
Well, I don't lose sleep about it right now, but the point is that I don't think the rate of interest that we're paying right now, which is, the bank rate is 0.5%, is going to last forever. I can remember interest rates back in 1981 when my mortgage went to 21%. That was a shock, I can tell you.
Well, yeah, and even around 1989, I can remember paying 13.25%, which is unfathomably large numbers compared to today.
You got it. And when I got my mortgage came due to renew, I mean, it was a shock to the bond family accounts, and we had to make significant adjustments in our expenditure patterns to service the mortgage because I didn't want to lose my home.
And that's the risk to people who today either have a variable rate mortgage or who have a mortgage that will come due at some point in the future, which is everybody, I guess. If the rates are higher, and people don't really grasp that, I guess. They figure, well, I've got my variable rate mortgage, I'm paying 2.5%. Well, I guess if mortgage rates went up to 5%, that's no big deal. It's only another 2.5%. But that's really a doubling of what you're paying. That would be a massive increase.
You got it. That's a doubling. It's a 100% increase.
Which is 100% more that you're paying each month. So that could be a significant issue. So how do you view the real estate market now then? Is it, and I realize there are many different markets, but in general, what do you see?
Well, people have tended to regard buying a house as a major investment that would provide them with significant gains because housing prices always go up. Well, they don't always go up, and I think that's something that has to be explained to people. The second thing is I think the market is a function of the growth of the population, and we had a tremendous demand for housing when the baby boomers, who are now approaching retirement, went into the market, and they all wanted houses just like their mom and dad had. And now the millennials are finding that they want to have houses just like mom and dad had. The housing stock hasn't increased that much, and so as a consequence, the prices are going up. And I think you're going to see a change in the structure of the housing stock in many centers. Let me give you an example. In 1895, the city of New York, the borough of Manhattan, the island, was primarily classified and zoned for residential housing. Well, the number of individual residents in the island of Manhattan, you could count maybe on both hands and both feet. I mean, it's changed drastically. Most of the housing is in apartments or in condominiums. There are very few independent housing. I mean, the former mayor of New York, Mr. Bloomberg, had an independent townhouse, but was worth $28 million, and most people really can't afford that with a salary of, say, $60,000.
No, that's true. That's true. And
so the housing stock changed, and that's what's going to happen in Canada. That means you've got to change the zoning, and there is a large growing evidence in Canada that many people feel that their community should never change the structure. Well, that's just not going to happen. It's going to change.
And so the change that's required is moving to more dense housing, for example. You can't have, typical residential housing in the center of a city. You need apartments, condos, that sort of thing?
Yeah, density is going to increase. I mean, it might start with housing along the laneways, and it also will result in apartment buildings and condos, etc. Not all 95 stories, but denser than they are now. I mean, the best example would be around the major stops on the Canada line. That's the line that goes from Richmond or the airport into the center of the city. And where the major stations are, the nature of the housing stock is starting to change pretty rapidly because people want to be able to walk to the subway and then get on and bang and go downtown.
As opposed to the old days where we got in our car and drove into the city center.
Yes, and the number of cars coming into the city center is just astronomical, and it's parking spaces. I mean, God, you know, if you own a parking space downtown, you're rich.
Yeah, it's more valuable than anything. So if you are giving advice to, let's say, a millennial, or even someone older than a millennial who at some point in the future wants to own a house, what is the advice you're giving to them today?
Think very carefully about that, and think about what you would get if you rented instead of buying. Because in many cases you'll get a superior accommodation for the amount of money you don't have to spend for accommodation. And you can take the difference and invest it in even a mutual fund and do just as well, if not better.
The counter-argument to that would be, though, hey, house prices always go up, and you and I realize that's not true, but house prices always go up. I want to own something. I don't want to be making the landlord rich. I don't want to be paying off someone else's mortgage. How do you get over that psychological barrier that you can actually become more wealthy not owning a home?
Well, I mean, I can do the numbers for them, but they may believe that it doesn't matter. It's sort of like a Trump supporter. No matter what he does, I still believe in him. Well, there are a lot of people that no matter what I show them, they still believe that a house is the best investment they can make. I think they're dumb, but, come on.
So the obvious answer is crunch the numbers. Don't let your emotion be guiding this.
That's what I would do.
Yeah, crunch the numbers.
Exactly. And the question you have to ask yourself is, let's take a typical house in, say, an urban center like, well, we'll take a Hamilton, where I grew up. How often do you spend time on the sidelawns of your house, or sitting in the front lawn of your house?
In the winter, not very much in Canada.
Even in the summer, not very much.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you use intensively your backyard, but not the front and side yards. Well, that's, come on. That's not an efficient use of space. And the message that I got as an undergraduate in geography, not economics, is that there isn't any more land being created. Well, I mean, there's a small amount in volcanic places, but I don't think you want to live there.
Iceland's very beautiful, actually, but yes, you're right. That's not my first choice, probably. So we also have to rethink the way we actually live. Then is what you're saying. This vision of the picket fence and the yard and stuff. You've got to ask yourself: am I actually going to use it, or would I be better investing my resources elsewhere?
Yeah, and I mean, there are a lot of people who live in apartments who don't seem to have suffered greatly. I mean, think of Paris, or think of London, or think of New York City, or think of Chicago. I mean, come on. Major urban centers, you don't have a front lawn, a back lawn, and side lawns. You live in an apartment, and your kids don't go up, with two heads or something. You live in a different lifestyle. That's all. Well,
and I guess New York City would be a classic example because you're only a 20-minute subway ride away from Central Park, no matter where you live. So if you really want to get outside and walk, then it's certainly easy to do that. And, of course, in a place like New York City, you're walking everywhere anyways. You're not driving. You're taking the subway or a taxi or something perhaps. So the yard with the garage and everything is much less important. So we really do have to rethink it.
Anybody who owns a car in Manhattan is either filthy rich, I mean really filthy rich, or crazy. I mean, I think Mr. Bloomberg has a car. But and I have a couple of friends in New York City, but they're filthy rich, and they spend $40,000 a year for parking.
Wow!
I mean, come on.
Yeah. you raise another interesting issue, and that is about the filthy rich. So let's talk about them for a minute here. So what are your thoughts on income inequality? So do you worry that it seems like the rich keep getting richer? We've got this bigger and bigger divide. Is that a concern going forward?
Yes, to me it's a significant concern. It means that there's a section of the population which really is detached from the welfare of the community as a whole. They are able to float above it, as it were. And I think that we've got to look at what's causing this inequality and then say maybe we can lessen it. We can slow it down from growing, and I think it would be a good thing, because I think that the more commonality that exists amongst the population, the greater is the concept of the community and what the community needs for its own welfare.
What do you think?
Well-being.
So what do you think is causing it?
Well, I think in many ways the tax system is one of the things. I mean, the fact is that capital gains are treated at a favorable rate. And I believe in what the Carter Commission, which was the Royal Commission that looked at the tax system back in the 60s, said, that a buck is a buck is a buck. How I get $1 in my hand, whether it's through capital gains or whether it's through working, is immaterial, because the impact of the dollar is the same. So why do we offer special taxation for capital gains?
So let's just take a step back here and explain. I mean, I'm a chartered accountant, so I understand what you're talking about. But for people who are listening, tell me the difference. Well, like, what is a capital gain?
Let's suppose I buy something for $100 and I sell it 10 years later for $1,000. The difference in the price between $100 and $1,000 is the capital gain. Nothing was done except the passage of time. And the capital gain would be the $900. Or if I bought a house, say the house that I bought in Vancouver when I first went out there to teach for $40,000, last year sold for $1.9 million. Now, it wasn't my house anymore. I sold it many, many, many years ago. But the difference between the $40,000 that I paid for the house and the $1.9 million, which would have been $1,860,000, was the capital gain. And then only have to pay tax on 50% of it.
Because in Canada, you only pay tax on half the capital gain. So in effect, the tax rate is half of normal tax.
But the point is, with housing, unlike other capital gains, that's tax-free.
Hmm.
So that means I would have had $1.86 million tax-free. Now, the question was...
because it was your principal...
necessary.
So your principal residence you don't pay tax on no matter what the gain is.
Right.
A capital gain, you pay tax at half the rate. So
you get tax on half of the capital gain.
Okay.
You pay it at your marginal tax rate.
Gotcha. So, and a classic example of that would be I buy a stock and it goes up.
Yeah.
That would be a capital gain.
That's usually the one. I know some friends who, for example, bought, when they were in college, an MGB and kept the damn thing in a garage for 30 years, and they can sell it for 5 times what they paid for it. But the number of people that keep their MGBTs in a garage are, you can count them on one hand.
Yeah, presumably there's some costs related to that, insurance and so on. So, and then obviously regular income then is taxed at full rate. So the income I get from my job. And so your point is, why should I pay more tax when I go out and work than what I would pay if I didn't work, which is what a capital gain is?
Yeah, and now the argument is advanced, for example, by startups as well. We can't pay good salaries, so we give people stock options. And the best example of that is a guy by the name of Gates, who lives down in Seattle. He got a lot of options in a company called Microsoft.
I think I've heard of him. Yeah, Bill. I've heard of him.
Yeah, he made $70 billion. Well, it was all capital gain. Now the basic point is that if you give in a startup people stock options because you don't pay them money, I think that when they cash them in, they should pay it that it's income. It's just deferred income.
So I mean, everything you're saying makes sense, but let's explore this. I'll be the devil's advocate here. So I'm going to be starting a company, and I'm going to pay my employees, full rates, so I won't give them any special treatment, let's say. But let's say I've got to, attract investors, and investors have many different places to put their capital. They can put it in the bank and earn 1 or 2%, or they can invest it in my new company, which they may make a lot of money on, or they may go bust. I mean, most new companies don't exist 5 years later. So is there not some rationale when it comes to creating jobs to be giving favorable tax treatment to the people who are actually taking risks to start businesses?
Well, I think there's lots of different ways you can do that other than the tax system. And I think that this favorable treatment of capital gains is one of the major causes of income inequality. And I think that income inequality has gone to an extreme lately. I mean, the 100 richest people in the United States have more wealth combined than all of the African American population in the United States, and they're 1/4 of the population of the United States.
So it's an insane disparity then between the top and everybody else. So you talked about the tax system then. So capital gains would be one modification you could make, just eliminate the concept of capital gains. A buck is a buck, as you say. Are there other changes in the tax system that you would contemplate?
Well, I have to tell you that I don't read the tax code for recreational purposes, and so there are a raft of what are called tax expenditures, special exemptions granted to people over the course of time. And I would look at each and every one of those tax expenditures and say which ones are actually working. For example, the Harper government put in a favorable tax deduction for buying public transit, and you could deduct the cost of it. And the point is that it appeared to have zero impact on public transit. Well, I would say that let's take a look at all of these little exemptions that you get when you fill out your income tax and say, are they really doing what they were there for? And if they're not doing it, stop it.
Make the system much simpler. So what about, let me throw two other concepts at you then. Basic income, where every Canadian got a set amount either through a negative income tax or through a check every month. Would that help remove some of this income inequality?
Well, I think it would to some degree. Now, there's something that I think that people aren't aware of. If you have a large degree of poverty or near poverty in the population, that impacts the children in that group worse than anybody else. They wind up with, you don't study very well when you're hungry. You don't study very well when you don't have enough clothes to keep you warm in the wintertime. And all of those things lead to the creation of an underclass. Now, the underclass really are the ones that do the dishwashing in restaurants and the other menial tasks. But the point is, it's an expensive luxury because they use the health system more intensively. They use the justice system more intensively. They're just a burden to society. If we got rid of the flow of the flow into that class by eliminating poverty, the net savings to the country as a whole would be substantial. But to explain that to people, they say, well, gee, they're not doing a damn thing and they're getting my money. What goes? The point is, if you don't pay them now and stop them from going into that group, in other words, give them some skills and provide them with food, then the point is over time you're going to pay even more forever. And so I think it's a question of saying, what is it we really want in society? Do we want to have a continual sector of the society which is unskilled, poor health, given to crime, etc., or do we want to get a society where the welfare, the well-being of society is the number one concern of government? I think it's a simple thing as far as I'm concerned.
And how would you then feel about an increased minimum wage? The same sort of thought process?
Well, I agree with Milton Friedman, who was a far-right economist, as you may know, And Milton said, let's have a minimum wage, let's have a guaranteed income, but let's get rid of minimum wage. And I think that makes sense, because I think that the market will work in this case, and if the wage is too low, people won't go into it. They'll have a problem finding people. So, one of the things that's been happening here in the Okanagan traditionally paid lower wages than, say, other parts of British Columbia. It was sort of a sunshine benefit, apparently. Well, they're finding they can't find people to man all of these jobs because the wages are just not sufficient for anybody to survive. So wages are going up in the Okanagan, and there's great consternation among some business people. But hey, it's reality. The market works.
So basic income would be a basic support that you don't think would muck with the market too much, whereas minimum wage potentially would have negative impacts.
Yeah, now look, you'll always have people gaming the system, and you've got to accept that. There's no perfect way to deal with this, so where there is no, quote, cheating, end quote. There'll be some. But the point is, the cost of that cheating is a hell of a lot less than the cost of maintaining a portion of the population which is underskilled, poor health, and given to significant social problems.
Gotcha. So you're looking at society as a whole. So
you've got it.
Which kind of makes sense, I guess. So final question for you then. Looking at this from the point of view of a consumer, everything we've talked about, debt and so on, what is your overall advice to the individual person? What should they be thinking about? What should they be looking towards over the next year or two? What can they do to keep themselves out of trouble?
Okay, well, the first thing to realize is that your life expectancy, if you're a male, will be about 85, and if you're female, about 88. So what are you going to do after your career? In other words, how are you going to survive from, say, age 65 or maybe 70 by the time they get to be that age? Your retirement would last for another 18 or maybe 25 years. How are you going to support yourself? In other words, start thinking about stopping your consumption now and putting something away for your old age. Most people don't do that, and the baby boomers are a case extraordinaire of that. Many of them are going to face very significant reductions in their standard of living because they failed to save for their old age. So you can't start doing that too soon. I mean, if you start putting money away at the age of 25 and it's compounded even at 2%, it will double before you retire. And so you should think of that.
And I guess part of the problem with that is a lot of those baby boomers have a lot of debt right now. They're not even thinking about saving. They've got to work on getting rid of the debt first.
Yeah, well, I mean, they absolutely needed a boat, and they needed a skidoo, and they needed an all-terrain vehicle, and they wanted to go on vacations to Mexico or Hawaii, so they did it all, and they never thought about the future. And I'm saying, don't sacrifice for tomorrow for the passions of today.
That was my interview with David Bond, who has a PhD from Yale and has taught at universities, worked for the government, and worked as an economist for a big bank. Obviously, he has strong opinions on the risks for consumers in today's economy, and while I don't necessarily agree with everything he said, I think his practical advice bears repeating. Perhaps the most controversial statement he made was that, and I quote, "A lot of people think that a house is the best investment they can make. I think they're dumb," end quote. Well, my opinion is that you should never view a house as an investment, so I guess I agree with him there, because houses go up and down in value. If you think a house is a guaranteed moneymaker, you're more likely to buy a house that's bigger than you can afford and take on too big of a mortgage, and that can lead to financial disaster, particularly if house prices go down. I agree with Mr. Bond's advice. Crunch the numbers. Figure out exactly what it would cost to rent and to own, and seriously consider whether or not you really need a front porch that you'll never sit on, and then make an informed decision. I also agree with his point on our life expectancy. If you're alive today, it's likely that you'll live to be 85 years old or perhaps much older. Mr. Bond's advice is to live more frugally today so that you have more resources for the future. Mr. Bond made the comment that some people bought cars and boats and other luxury goods that they couldn't afford, and that has led to their debt problems. Well, for some people, that's true. For others, their problems were caused by circumstances outside of their control, like medical issues or job loss, so it's important not to paint everyone with the same brush. Regardless, Mr. Bond's final piece of advice is correct. And again, I quote, "Don't sacrifice for tomorrow for the passions of today." End quote. I agree that we must consider both today and tomorrow. If we focus on eliminating debt today, we can save for the future and have a secure retirement. That's our show for today. Full show notes, including a full transcript of today's show, can be found on our website at hoyes.com. That's HOYES.com. Thanks for listening. Until next week, I'm Doug Hoyes. That was Debt Free in 30.